All right, welcome back, AP Euro. So we're going to be hitting up the various revolutions of the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, which makes it sound like a horrible history radio channel spinning your favorite hits of the 20s, 30s, and today. All right, now this is a topic that usually I would pound through in a couple days worth of notes and like really try to dig in and explain, but because of COVID wrecking the world and destroying our hopes and dreams, we're going to do this in a faster, quicker version through. So if this is too fast, obviously just feel free to pause your video or go back through it. But I'm going to try to really go through this quickly. Okay, so the point of this background, which again you don't need every point here to be kind of restated, but we need to establish the prevailing norm at the time. And the prevailing norm in the 20s, 30s, and 40s was the Congress system. Right? The Congress of Vienna was dominating European politics. The conservative order had won, and so we've tried to check the nationalism and liberalism of the French Revolution. Napoleon scared the hell out of Europe, and so now the traditional powers are trying to keep things locked nicely away. And so war is uncommon, peace is the order of the day, conservatism is the order of the day, and they are deathly afraid of revolution. And so this just gives examples of all these different congresses. Now, the point behind this is not to know all the congresses, but the point is that anytime there was a flare-up somewhere in Europe, right, and most of these are in France or Italy, but there were many in Spain. We're going to look at something in Prussia, in Frankfurt, called the Carlsbad Decrees. These are all examples of where a European state hit the panic button, right, and freaked out because they had college students or liberals or socialists demonstrating for the vote, getting a little bit rowdy, looking for nationalist unifications. And so that, they'd call in the big boys and the troops would come in and they would violently crush the people, much like what happened at Peterloo massacre in Manchester during the Industrial Revolution, right? Protesters asking for the vote, they just come in there and kill people. That's the norm of the day, right? So here are the traditional powers sitting there getting ready to squash things, and yet little baby Prussia hiding under the table. There's just a little hint of nationalism still under the table that they haven't caught yet. All right, so when I say conservatism, I think you guys all remember this, but remember we're going back to the Congress of Vienna, and so these people were kind of the ones in the driver's seat. And so they were mainly monarchists, is really what we're kind of looking at, and they would have looked at society as progressing, and hierarchy and the natural order of society as requiring social classes. That was natural to have hierarchy in society. And they would look at the Enlightenment and a lot of those ideas of individual rights, natural rights, social contracts is actually dangerous. It's what happened in the French Revolution. When people overthink it and demand too much, they end up chopping heads off because they fall in love with the theory and not with logic or the principles that are supposed to be guiding the theories. And so liberalism could be downright frightening, scary. Think of how the Romantics viewed science, for example, or the Enlightenment. Okay, so our first example that I want to look at is what was going on in Austria. Now, there's a lot more to say about this, but specifically in the 18 teens, Prussia was going through an identity crisis. And what I mean by that is Napoleon had swept through, made the Rheinbund, the Confederation of the Rhine. German nationalism was growing. It looked like a Frenchman might actually stir the middle class of Prussia into some enlightened revolution. And Austria, hell no, did not want that. And so Metternich pumped the brakes hard. Now, we read some documents about this. If you remember, we read about Metternich, and he was talking to other mayors and governors and warning them about the sweet-talking propaganda of Napoleon, to be afraid of it. And he was also saying that these college professors that allow students to get all liberal, and these student groups, these fraternities that talked about German nationalism and liberal voting and stuff, they're dangerous, right? And so Metternich calls in the troops to shut them down. And so we actually read an excerpt from the Carlsbad Decrees where they told professors, you will lose your job if you profess or talk about liberalism in your classes. It's a dangerous ideology. Now that stops Prussian nationalism, German nationalism. That's going to kind of put a temporary blanket on what was going on in Frankfurt and what they called the Burschenschaft, these student groups. Okay, now in Britain, at the exact same time, we've already talked about like the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws, right, were these like artificial barriers to importing foreign grain, which meant that poor people had to pay a fortune for domestic grain. But that's not liberalism, right? That's like a conservative backlash. And so liberals got pissed. And so people start advocating for universal suffrage and men having more votes. And now, granted, that's more radical republicanism. But the conservative order viewed it as a threat. And they came in and violently shut it down. That is a norm across Europe at the time. The press was censored. Habeas corpus was withdrawn for a while. And so the conservative order pushed back, right? And England always has that weird balancing act between, like, if we don't give some reforms, like the Factory Act or the Reform Bill of 1832, like, we're going to have revolution or revolt. But we don't want to go so far where we actually give a lot of people a vote, because what happens if too many middle-class guys get a vote? We're going to lose conservative control, and this is going to turn into a middle-class playground run by millionaires. And so there's always that odd kind of balancing act in Britain. Okay, I'm going to skip the Americas for right now, because although interesting, for our sake, that's not going to be crucial to talk about. Okay, so let me really quickly go through this list of stuff, and then we'll stop, and then I'll go through kind of blow by blow some of the other revolutions of the time period. So what we're trying to get at is conservatism wasn't going to stop or roll back the clock. They couldn't undo everything from the French Revolution or the Enlightenment. That was not even necessarily their goal. But what they were afraid of, right, is that they would lose the ship. And what I mean by that is if voting became too universal and if student movements became too popular, the privilege of monarchs and of the old regime nobles would erode away and it would never come back again. And so that's what they were really afraid of. Now, this is a key point to all of this. I'm going to skip to this point right here. What we notice in 1830 and especially in the revolutions of 1848 is this point. The under society, and we saw this in the French Revolution. It's easy to remember this. When you think about the French Revolution, the middle class and the sans culotte, the common people, right, were in it together. Their revolution was a combination of their two classes. What is going to equal the failure of a lot of these revolutions of 1830 and especially the revolutions of 1848 is once the revolution gets going and a king leaves or the nobles flee, these two groups turn on each other. The middle class usually has limited views, and these urban lower classes usually have much more socialist or even quasi-communist views, and then they put themselves at odds with being too moderate and too radical. That sounds familiar. That's semi-similar to the French Revolution with like the early phase of the revolution and kind of like what the Girondins represented, and more of like the later phases during the Reign of Terror, de-Christianization, the sans culotte and the Mountain, the Jacobins, right? That's that more radical stuff. And so really at the end, what we notice is like so much violence and so much change and possible success. And then sadly at the end, a lot of it ends up being kind of a failure. Right? It doesn't really necessarily go anywhere. The other theme that we're going to notice a lot in these revolutions of 1830 and 1848 is these governments were savage, bro. I mean, they came in there and killed people in the tens of thousands. They had no problem calling in the military, loading the muskets and the cannons, and just unloading on their own people, right? As Napoleon once said when he put down revolutionary action in France, they gave him a whiff of grape shot. And that's such a sad thought, but that really was the prevailing norm. These revolutionaries died in the thousands. All right, so I'm going to come back, I'm going to cut this in half, and then we're going to look at some specific examples of these revolutions, starting with, as you can see, Russia. All right, so we'll come back in just a little bit. All right, see ya in a minute.